We are in the chapter titled The Planes of Our Existence in Sri Aurobindo's Synthesis of Yoga, where in a kind of a brief summary we will review the key ideas and themes covered. To begin with, Sri Aurobindo points out that in a conventional yoga which aims at withdrawal from the world, the knowledge of the various planes of existence is not necessary. You only need to know two planes, your mind which is embodied and then the spiritual, and in between you have your reason and power of intellect and logic which can somehow cut through the appearances that the mind creates and by a force of will break out of that illusory formation and merge into the spiritual. So you're only concerned with two planes, and the rest, even if one knows about them, which most traditions do, they consider the awareness of other planes as a distraction and a possible stumbling block to that emergence in the Brahman, because there are powers associated with these planes and dangers associated with them. And so you put yourself in exclusive concentration on that emergence in the one and break out and finish it. But since the integral yoga accepts world existence as full of the presence of the divine, and the goal is to manifest increasingly the divine consciousness and possibilities in the world, we have not only to recognize these distinctive planes of existence, but also learn to navigate through them and even to master what they represent as powers of manifestation. And because we see all immersed in the divine presence, these planes need have no terror for us, or rather, he says, whatever dangers and distractions there may be, we have to face and overcome them. And if the world is complex, then we have to embrace that complexity, and our knowledge must then grow to include that complexity. Having made this the basis for a deeper exploration of the planes of consciousness, Sri Aurobindo then enters into the whole formulation. When we view all these planes, we find a complex mix of so many powers, so many gradations of consciousness, each leaning to join the other in a complex interwoven fabric, that we discover there are many ways in which we can articulate this structure of creation. And this has been, he says, the goal of so many disciplines, so many traditions all over the world, which seek for this larger knowledge. In the West, in particularly in Europe, it came under the category of occultism, whereas an equivalent word does not exist in Eastern traditions, because he says the veil is not so thick. The veil being thinner, the access was easier. And this is something which we will come back to later after discussing these planes and review what the veil means. Because for our yoga, both individually and collectively, the thinning of the veil is an absolute necessity. And although we have looked at it in a general way earlier, we will come back to this discussion later. So here Sri Aurobindo chooses deliberately to take the framework developed by the Vedic system, not only because it is much more comprehensive, but especially because it is already structured for the spiritual objective of liberation and transformation. And he says it is at once the simplest and the most philosophical, because from the beginning it was envisaged from the point of view of utility, to the goal of liberation. And it bases itself on the three lower principles of our ordinary being, which are mind, life and matter, the triune spiritual principle of Sat, Chit, Ananda, and the link principle of supermind, Vijnana. And with this broad framework, he begins the description. He defines here, and I had mentioned in that part of the study, that this is the only place, the only literature in the whole world you will find across known history where you have a definition of what makes for different gradations of consciousness or planes of consciousness. And Sri Aurobindo describes this as the we mean a general, for what do we mean by plane of consciousness or plane of existence? We mean a general settled poise or world of relations between Purusha and Prakriti, between the soul and nature. And he explains how anything which we call world, existence itself, has really these two poises, the potentialities of existence and then the deploying of those powers of becoming. And this is the soul and nature, or Prakriti, or soul individual or soul cosmic, and on the other side, individual nature or universal Prakriti. And then, depending on these relations, you have experiences of various worlds, but you can have all kinds of worlds and mixes of all kinds also. Whatever the relation will determine the world, but what makes for the world to have a special characteristic? And there he goes into the key idea that always it is being, conscious force and delight, which are the three constituent terms of existence. And so every world is characterized by how these three are expressed in that world. So we saw then in great detail, he describes the physical world where being is as if identified with materiality, and force of consciousness is seen through processes of matter, of nature, and the delight is the attempt to experience through the senses or to grow aware. But all these three are constantly bound, held back and hampered by the very character of rigidity of matter and the rigidity of form which comes with it. And it describes in great detail what makes the physical world what it is. And it seems almost as if it is designed to prevent you from experiencing the Sat, Chit and Ananda. And so everything seems to be bound in darkness. But that very factor also makes it, he points out, in the very logic of things, if the existence, consciousness, force and delight are bound, then the goal of that world is to release them. Because if something is bound, the goal of binding it is so that it may emerge once again and be revealed. And so the physical world becomes, in its very nature, the realm where evolution and the unfolding of possibilities not seen or even seen as impossible has to become inevitable. This is a kind of a broad summary of what we covered in that description. And then Sri Aurobindo says there is also a poise of relation between Purusha and Prakriti in which matter is not the first determinant. It is above the realm of matter where life force takes its place as the first determinant. Here, life determines form, not form determining life as in the material world. And so there is a shift in the whole relationship. Life force becomes now free and fluid and able to work itself out as it wants. It is not an inconscient material force as in matter. Rather, it is a conscious force of being which makes for formation. It wants to create forms, but it is much more a force essentially for enjoyment, possession and satisfaction of its own impulse. And since satisfaction of impulse is what we call desire, he calls this also, he says we can call it a desire world, where desire of life force is the law of the world. But because it is not bound to the rigidity of matter, the play of life energies is much more fluid, and it creates many finer gradations of its play. And this makes for the fact that there are many subplanes within the life world, which you do not see in the physical world. In the physical world, subplanes are seen more as higher, freer operations of matter, because everything is matter first. So, life energy, taking form of flower, for example, would effectively represent in the physical world a subplane compared to, let's say, stone, which would be non-living matter. Except because it is all made of matter, and that's the character of the material world, you do not see it as a subplane. It is all part of one continuum, of one objectivized experience. And this is something very interesting, because it means that only on the physical plane can you have a true sense of objectivity in the experience. That is, all of us can look at this flower and say, yes, it is such and such flower, it is red colored, this diameter of the flower is about 1.5 centimeters, maybe 1.8 if we are accurate. And it's objective enough because space is rigid. Time is almost physically bound in its unfolding. So the clock in your house and the clock in my house actually end up remaining pretty much synchronized. And all of this is unique to the physical world. You enter the vital or mental or any of the higher worlds, none of this would apply. In those domains, each one of us seeing this as not material substance but life bundle of consciousness would experience it in some pretty distinctive ways. The form in which it would represent to our observing consciousness would also be different. Although the quality of consciousness we would say is same, its representation to us might be different. The sense of size would be fluid. Depending on how you relate to it, it will be very close to you and very large and overwhelming in its perfume or influence. Or depending on your disaffinity to it, you might feel it distant, small, far, weak, etc. And each one might register it differently. And so, the sense of an objective experience where all of us could have a shared common experience is actually limited to the physical world. Imagine now what this means. I'm skipping the whole logic of the description, but imagine when the Satchidananda manifests in matter and reveals itself in matter, we would each of us be able to experience aspects or powers or revelations of the Satchidananda in a collective, objectified experience. Of course, each one has a subjective sense of absorption of the experience, but we could agree upon the objective aspect of its form. And it is in this sense that the physical part of the mind also, bound in the material world, allows for very objective, rational, structured argumentation, which in the mental world may not have the same kind of limitation. In the mental world, depending on how you look at things, the truth also may seem to vary because there's a certain fluidity there. Now all of this is perhaps not following the sequence of the text, but in recapitulation, these are important ideas we have to recognize. All of this makes for the physical world to be the most exceptional domain for the experience of an unfolding evolution and for the experience of divinity manifested. Nowhere else among all the rest of the cosmos can you have this kind of experience. And so the soul actually, from its too perfect delight in the Satchidananda, leans down and sees, wow, what an adventure. And it descends to take part in this adventure for this purpose. because of what it means, and for the divine equally to manifest such a possibility is one of the most important aspects of the whole creation. So, I'm coming back to the text itself. Sri Aurobindo then describes the character of the vital world, as we saw, multiple gradations which make for subplanes, but he also explains that nothing in nature has any rigid boundary. Everything in nature is part of a scale of being which is infinite. No gap, no wide gulfs, no abrupt chasms. Everything melts into everything else in a subtle continuity. And so, in the vital world, you have finer gradations, each blending into the next. And the mind then experiencing these things, or the power of nature to separate them, makes for distinctive gradations or possibilities of experience. But he also explains that enjoyment being the drive, desire being the drive of the vital world, the trend being desire, the desire is not bound, is not free, it is bound. The moment your consciousness is driven by desire, it is also bound in the direction that the desire pushes you to. And therefore he says that the possibilities of enjoyment there are enormous, intense, and even continuous, inconceivable to our physical experience, but equally the possibility of enormous sufferings on the negative side. Because the moment you have introduced something which binds and limits, it creates for a split of positive and a negative. And so the vital world is also the domain of all of the highest heavens of the religious experience, as well as the most terrible of the hells of the religious experience, or even the human imagination. We paused on this idea because we saw also so much of what is described as the goal of religions actually stops short with the vital worlds. Even the highest heavenly domains of the religions are nothing but the highest ranges of the vital, which turn towards the spiritual but still live in the vital. The very fact that the heaven of the religion is contrasted with the hells, and the experiences in the heaven have their counterpart of an opposite experience in the hells, shows you that these are not the domains of pure spirit, which are defined by oneness and not duality. And it is at best, you can say, the part of the spiritual blending into the vital, or the part of the vital turning towards the spiritual, but still belonging to the domain of the vital. And it is into these heavens or hells that people tend to pass through in their passage after leaving the physical world, in what is called death. And for many of the traditions, this is the goal, and it stops there. This factor is so important when we begin to really understand how much of what passes for spirituality is only an exploration of the higher ranges of the vital worlds. It is quite shocking. Even today, so much of phenomena are associated with spirituality. If somebody materializes an object and gives it to you, instinct in the normal human being who does not know discriminate is to view that as something spiritual and precious, and you want to keep it on your body because now this is divinely sanctified because it was materialized. And sometimes it's disappointing when you see people get stuck with these trinkets. In reality, if they knew how it was materialized, the rationale of the materialization, they would give to it no other value. But well, that's how it is. But this is a very important wake up to recognize how much goes and how much of the vital actually masquerades as the spiritual. Equally, so many of the spiritual beings, including what are the Vedic deities in their cosmic origin, have the representations on all the planes of their functions. And so on the vital world they have their representations. The mother speaks of, and we read it in one of the texts, Mahakali, who belongs properly to the supramental realm, has her representation in the vital world, and as Kali, or one of the aspects which is associated with Kali. And then what you see there is a form, is a representation, is a limited expression. But for people to relate to that form is often the end all of spirituality. Ignoring the fact that at best this form is the gateway to the true liberated and more complete cosmic divine aspect. But these are the things which you see in most of the religious traditions, and of course there are innumerable aspects, and so innumerable forms, qualities, powers, but also they enter in collision. On the vital world, each of these deities in their representation may collide because now they are limited aspects and often representing contrary qualities. And so for us it is extremely important to be able to go all the way through to those aspects, even if we look at the aspects as entry points to the oneness of the divine Shakti, the divine Mother, the divine consciousness and Satchidananda. It is only in that oneness that we can meet them in their completeness and experience all their powers and aspects fully harmonized. And this is why in the integral yoga, Sri Aurobindo takes pains to not stop short and concentrate on the oneness. You will recall the experience which Mother narrates in the early stage of the ashram formation, when to bring down the supramental, they recognized that they had to establish, they needed the cooperation of the, what Sri Aurobindo calls the overmental deities, and these are the gods. And to be able to have their cooperation in matter was the immediate goal. The Mother created this world of the overmental gods, connecting them with several beings human beings in the ashram. And the result was an extraordinary revelation of powers and great, even magical demonstrations which came through these people. And at some point they saw where it was going, and Sri Aurobindo said it would create perhaps the greatest religion in the world. But he said we have to forego the short-term benefit for the long-term, for a greater truth. And the Mother dissolved that entire formation, and the work then was to aim directly to the supramental and bypassing this intermediate passage. But we understand why. Because the moment these are manifested, they become almost an end in themselves to the human consciousness. And however wonderful and dramatic they might be to the human mind, they would prevent that oneness from revealing in its full harmony and glory. So again, I'm diverting, but these are things we can understand in the context of what has been discussed. Sri Aurobindo then goes on to describe how having described the vital world and the physical world, he says there is a complex unity in nature, and it is not a collection of unrelated phenomena, and therefore there is no unbridgeable gulf between the material existence and this vital or desire world. There is a constant interface, exchange, and even a continuum that is created. And they exist within each other, he says. And what is their relationship? And an entire paragraph, which we have been seeing in some detail over the span of several weeks, where each sentence actually establishes one of the fundamental principles on which the whole science of occultism is built. And it is something so extraordinary because he summarizes them in sequence, as if building one upon the other, like a scientist, building from first principles to the more complex ones. And each principle then becomes the basis for an entire body of not only knowledge, but application of knowledge as a technology which could make for the complete body of occult knowledge across all systems, if one took pains to develop it into its more specific and distinct forms. But understanding these, you can look at all these traditions and go straight to the core of their practices and even their philosophical formulations. You can go straight to the core and say, this is what it is, this is what they're trying to do, this is how this thing works. And you can as if deconstruct the appearances and go to the core of it, and either take that insight and reformulate it in terms relevant to you, or perhaps completely bypass that method and take a more direct spiritual method to achieve the same result. But very quickly, in summary, Sri Aurobindo points out that first of all, the physical world is as if a projection of the vital. And that means within the physical world, the vital consciousness is embedded, or it is the principle on which the physical world is built. And so, as if energy of life force is bound inside matter in its most extreme. So you see the relationship of the vital and the physical world as a continuum, but almost like the densest expression of the vital thrown out into separation makes for the physical world. And in this insight already you have the key to the secret of materialization. This is how a physical object is created, when the vital consciousness gathers itself and expels from it its most dense and coarse part, projecting out to create the physical material. Of course, behind that one has to, since we have not yet touched the mental world, there is the mental power that wields the vital energy. And so that has to be first mastered, which then leads to this outcome. I am tempted to share other interesting aspects which we have not yet touched. In phenomena such as changing of matter, or even occult interventions to transmute matter, it's a similar function, similar process that works, though the mind plays a greater role. And perhaps we should look at that in greater detail after Sri Aurobindo describes the mental world. But broadly, the concept is simply this: the mind consciousness is what leads life force. The form of mind idea is the template which guides life energy flow, and the life energy flow is the template which materializes into the physical, material, denser gradation. And so once you recognize these things as a continuum, you can see how an operation begun at the higher level moves down gradations until eventually it creates a physical change. And I was, as part of my last conference that I was at, which was in an institute in the US that works on science and spirituality, but more from the material scientific perspective, they had as one of the events in the evening, which somehow was not announced, but it was just a cluster of people, they had what they call spoon bending parties. And so the people are asked to hold a spoon, and then they shout, bend, 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 and at some point you get the spoon to bend. And which is quite fascinating in itself as an experience. But you can see distinctly the moment when the spoon softens. If you're pushing with your hand, suddenly you feel the spoon soften, and it just curls. You can curl it just like that, and then it hardens again. But for those who are now into it, they literally hold the spoon and the spoon bends just like that, with nothing happening. One could of course do the same thing with the help of energies or beings from the vital world, but what is seen here is that your mind has an influence on the energy within the spoon. But that influence itself is competing against your own belief that this is not possible. And so there are layers of your deeper part of the mind which know, which compete against the surface mind which is believing it's not possible. And so often what happens is, people are trying, it doesn't happen, and someone in the group suddenly says, look, my spoon bent. And so your attention goes, how is that? And at that moment your spoon bends. Because your resisting part of the mind is set aside or misdirected, and the other part comes in. And bit by bit, it's as if one unifies the deeper shraddha, the deeper knowledge or conviction on an inner level with the more surface parts, until for you it's an acceptable thing to happen, and so it can happen more easily. But what you see there is the deep intimacy of the mind consciousness, which is involved in the life energy, which is involved in the material form, and so your mind can connect there, your life force can connect there and somehow change things from inside. Not this surface thinking mind which can only initiate a movement of intentionality, but your own deeper layers, subliminal parts which are more naturally connected and through which the whole thing happens. So this is the first point he makes about the relationship between the vital and physical world. And he says literally, life on earth is the result of this pressure of the life world on the physical world. And so again you get a key here of the nature of life. And if you can now build on this, catch the rhythms of movements of the life world and their pressure on the physical world, tap into that, you can amplify life processes in the physical world. For example, the tides, physical tides are really a representation of the relationship between sun, moon and earth. If it was only gravity of the moon, you would not be able to explain why on a full moon the tide is stronger. And sun's gravity is hardly nominally present in relation to the moon, so it should not make such a big difference. In fact, it is the relationship of sun, moon, earth on the vital world which is the bigger tide. And so the moon's light growing is associated with the tide of life energy building in the vital world, and the moon waning is associated with a dimming of life force in the world generally as a tide of the vital world. And if you recognize that life in the physical plane is the result of the pressure of this life, you can catch that movement. You plant the seed when the moon is beginning to wax. And the result is the seed gets a larger burst of vital energy, and so the plant grows more healthy or more rapidly and so on. And so many of our ancient traditions were built on these tides, the recognition of lunar tides and solar tides, of course operating on different parts of our being, the solar tides often having a greater influence on the mind, and aligning with these and utilizing their influence on the physical world. So again, a very simple statement that Sri Aurobindo gives here, which normally you would read through and say, oh yeah, he is just describing the relationship, not recognizing that this is in fact the seed principle on which the whole science is built, of an entire realm of operations of what is called occultism. And you could then actually, recognizing this principle, consciously intensify the flow of life force on a material object and therefore modify its material behavior or characteristics. This question in fact came up in the last conference that I was at, where I had tried to present the yogic perspective of the relationship between the consciousness, matter and life, because it was in the context of intentional energy healing. So the healing we see in the physical world, the energy is of the vital world, intention is in the mental world. You cannot speak of these things without understanding the complex relationship between these three. And part of the problem which scientists have is, how does healing take place spontaneously when there was no intention even? And they don't recognize that intention can be of many kinds. And there can be an individual conscious intention, there will be an inner subliminal intention, there's an intention of the soul, there's an intention of the collective environment, and all of these have a complex mix. So I've tried to bring in some of these aspects. But following the presentation in the Q&A, somebody asked this question: what is the exact mechanism by which energy or mind are connected to matter? And there were two others who kind of said, well, it's something which we have not yet found, it is better left unspoken, it should remain a mystery. But my view was different. I said this is the single most important question which has to do with the future of humanity. I'm speaking, of course, in a material, technological level. I said because all of current technology is matter operating on matter. But the future technology will be life force and mind operating on matter. And if you can find this interface, you will be able to create results where mind and life can operate on matter technologically as a machine. A phone, for example, rather than needing a physical touch, could receive the mind imprint of your intention and respond spontaneously. Equally, the connection would go the other way. Using a mechanism, you could influence life force, amplify the vital energy within you, or even assist in infusing or imprinting aspects of knowledge or mental experience into the person. This, in fact, would represent the real future of technology. So to me, that question is extremely important. And here Sri Aurobindo is giving you the key principles on which that technology can be built up. So I'm scanning through quickly, but you get the idea of how important this whole thing can be. You can actually direct the life force and amplify its impact on the physical object or body and change its characteristics, healing being one of the results of that. And he says that our manifest vital being is surface result of a larger, profounder vital being which is connected to the life world. So now it gives to us again a very important insight. The life world through the human can actually connect to the surface vital. And this linkage has massive implications, some of which we have touched in our earlier discussions. But I'll move on. Then he says, this life world is constantly acting upon us, and behind everything in material existence there stand appropriate powers of the life world. That's another layer now of the knowledge on which a whole technology can be built up, and a whole science and occult application. So through us the influences go, but also behind every object there is an appropriate power. Behind the flower there is an appropriate vital frame of energy which makes this possible. If you withdraw that, the flowers will fade immediately, almost instantly. You will recall the mother describing how her teacher of occultism, Madame Thion, showed her how she took a little, what was the grapefruit, placed it on her stomach and absorbed the life force directly. And the grapefruit shrunk to become a little fist-like thing, dried out completely. It was never cut. What was withdrawn was only life force. The physical result of it was the shriveling, shrinking and drying up. What does that tell you? The content of the juice of the grapefruit was not taken out through a cut. But when the life force was absorbed, the juice also vanished. In other words, the primary content of that juice substantially is the life force animating and even expanding it. You withdraw the life force, everything shrinks. And she said it was about half an hour, if I recall right. Something about half an hour to an hour. But the reverse is equally possible. You could infuse vitality into it and it would expand. Very interesting suggestions. But what it tells you here is the actual content of the flower, or the grapefruit for that matter, is the life energy bundle, and it's complex, which makes this possible. Take it out and this will collapse. Sustain it and this will stay fresh. Massive implication again. You will recall the incident, maybe I've narrated here, which was told to us by Ravindraji. He was put by the mother in charge of the ashram fruit room, and one of his responsibilities was, of course, distributing fruits to the ashramites, but one of his responsibilities was specific fruits to be brought for the mother. And one day it came a large load of oranges, I believe. And mother said to him, I would like you to keep these oranges aside and give me a glass of orange juice every day, of 2 oranges every day. Now, you must recall this was a time when mother had practically stopped all food. She was only taking juices, practically no other source of nourishment physically. And so Ravindraji said, but mother, they will all spoil. Mother said, just do as I am asking you to do. So he puts them all in his storage room. I don't think we had an air conditioner at that time for the cooling, but whatever. And then he said, the first day, half the oranges spoiled. He had to throw them away. He reported to the mother. Mother said, just do as I've asked you. Second day, no oranges spoiled. He took out 2. Third day, no oranges spoiled. He took out 2. And it went on for more than a month. He says, not a single orange spoiled thereafter. And when the full stock was completed, he asked the mother, I believe, if I remember right, he asked the mother why that first lot, the first day, half of them spoiled. And mother said, you didn't have faith. What she had done, of course, didn't depend on him, but his receptivity would have made it more effective, more complete. So she had to work through him to some extent. She was perhaps trying to train him to develop that capacity that without any refrigeration, the fruits should be able to stay if you take the trouble to invoke that help and the divine Shakti. What did mother do? She brought her energy into this for this purpose, with that intention, infused it into the content of the fruit, and that's it. And she can do it now, if you ask for it. She was perhaps trying to train him to recognize that this is what he should be doing. But these are part of the human limitations. The first time, of course, it's impossible, and so there's this whole block which actually interferes with the action of the force. But anyway, this is an example of implications which come from this statement. Of course, you can build so much more once you get the idea that everything in the material existence, behind everything there stand appropriate powers of the life world. And if you tweak those powers, you can tweak the result on the material level. So if you take the plant and you relate to the plant directly, engage with the plant and ask the plant to change something or infuse into the plant a shift in its energetic character, its physical character will change. And I think this was an example we had taken, that mystic gardener was able to convince a rose bush to stop producing thorns because he said, I will protect you. And the result was the bush grew without thorns. But the potential here you can see is incredible. But this is true not only of living things, it is equally true of physical objects which are not non-living, as we call them. And so even behind a stone there is an equivalent principle or power. And this is, again, perhaps going too much in detail, but it's worth recognizing this. By arranging physical objects, you're also arranging their powers. It's a way by which physically you bind the vital energy qualities and bundles. It goes top down from the vital to the physical, you can modify, but it goes bottom up. By rearranging physically, you rearrange those powers and create a vital structure up there which produces results. And this is the basis for magic, occult, symbolic, structured practices of magic. And so, very smoothly, Sri Aurobindo moves to the next principle. The influence of the life world are always pouring out on the material existence, producing their powers and results, which return again upon the life world to modify it. So he gives you a picture which is two-way. Now things are pouring down from the life world into the material, and from the material equally moving back into the life world. And you can catch these streams of upward flow, manipulate them by manipulating physical objects, produce changes in the life world, change an environment, gather energies, modify energies, all kinds of things. You see, the whole science is being revealed to you from first principles. And then comes from that, the life part of us, the desire part, is being always touched and influenced. So from the life world, in our desire nature, you have the first direct link and strongest influence. And with it, he says, there too are beneficent and malefic powers of good desire and evil desire, which concern themselves with us even when we are ignorant and unconcerned with them. And so it enters a whole different dimension now of the knowledge. Beings which are conscious, not merely movements of energies and powers which are almost mechanical or semi-conscious or part of a universal rhythm and of tides, but conscious beings with conscious intentions, and then they are influencing you with desire. And we hardly recognize that so many of our desires are actually coming from outside us, even as so many thoughts within are coming from outside us. It's something which he will be speaking about in the next paragraph, but to recognize that 99% of the time we are puppets. With the illusion of choice or freedom, an impulse comes within me and I say, I am choosing this impulse, not realizing that the impulse itself was thrown into me from the life world by beings or even sometimes environmental influences which pop it up. And this is how you can understand what is otherwise incomprehensible to modern psychology in what is called crowd psychology, where an entire human collective suddenly starts behaving not only in exactly the same pattern, but coordinated across a large crowd. Spontaneously across the large crowd, people speak the same thing or do the same thing or feel the same thing without one influencing the other in a chain. And that's because it is the vital energy brought in or awakened in, which is now the driving energy, which is treating the whole crowd as one organism, one individual. And it shows you how easily humanity can be influenced, both positively and negatively, how vulnerable we actually are in our ignorance of these gradations of reality. But good desire and evil desire, and that's why you have so many strange experiences of people doing things which later they look back and regret and say, I don't know why I did it. It has many implications, one of which the mother observes is that when you put a criminal in jail, you have also effectively bound the power in the person. Let's say possessed criminal who's possessed by these evil energies. But if you execute the person, you're releasing the energy. And the energy goes out, the being goes out and hooks to another person who repeats the same thing now. And she points out that you will see whenever they have an execution, very soon you will find the same crime is committed by someone else. And this was the rationale she gave for not having what is it called? Life? Capital punishment. But it shows you how vulnerable we are to coming under those influences in a way that we cannot get free of them. And it is a serious warning for engaging in activities which invoke such powers and their chaotic influences, as in discotheques or certain types of music bands and programs which consciously invoke asuric influences, or where the whole theme is of an asuric representation of beings of the vital world. And young people say, it's fun, we are just imitating, we're just playing a game or putting up an appearance. No, it's not. The very fact that you attempt to connect to yourself with those symbols invokes those things. The words you speak invokes those things. The fact that you enter a group which has invoked those energies makes you now a puppet of those energies. And this is how a subtle form of possession begins, which slants thoughts, slants emotions, and particularly through desires gets a hook into you. And bit by bit you realize you are now more and more vulnerable to certain desire impulses until it seizes you and you are now in its grip. And that's it, the damage is done. It then warps your life completely in a different direction. And it may seem something so casual. Oh, I just went to attend a party. Everyone is doing it, so what's wrong if I do it? Just once, no problem. So it seems. But you don't realize what's happening on other levels. And if children have been raised with a certain sensitivity, they feel it suffocating. And they often force themselves to survive because of peer pressure. And the consequences are terrible. And if we do not understand this is the background behind what's really happening, we wouldn't know how dangerous some of these things can be. So he says, even if we are ignorant and unconcerned with them, well, they can hook into you and do stuff. And then he says, nor are these powers merely tendencies, inconscient forces, nor except on the verges of matter subconscious, but conscious powers, beings, living influences. And we looked upon at this also in some detail, but to give some key ideas, I'm trying as far as possible not to repeat what we have already discussed, but following the same line of ideas. Powers, conscious, beings which are conscious, and living influences. And one example which I wanted to share last time, we did not have enough time. You can create, for example, of course there are beings who rule spaces. You come into their space, you are in their domain, under their influence, whether you like it or not. But you can also create a living influence which is not necessarily a conscious being. And people coming into that influence are, well, slanted under it. And one example I wanted to share last time, you will find if you ever walk in a mall where there are lots of shops, or go to typical shopping areas in Indian cities, lines of shops, many of them having similar things. Sometimes they may have exactly the same products going down 5 shops. And yet you will find one of them is doing very well. One of them is selling more, the others are sitting more rows and nothing seems to be moving. And if you put yourself in that poise of a quiet, reflective state of consciousness where you are completely still and feel or reflect what is the difference between these 5 shops, you'll see the key. It's not the product, it's not the name of the shop, it's not the appearance, it's the energy content. As somebody walks, they are attracted to the energy here, and others are either neutral or even some of them could be repulsive. I want to enter, I see a good product, and somehow I feel repelled from the vibrational energy content of the shop. I turn to look at another, looking for that product there. And it's all happening at a subconscious or subliminal level, and if I glimpse it, I walk straight in. What just happened? And if you're not conscious, you don't know what really happened. If you are conscious, you see which shop is the attractive energy which is pulling. It's been built up. Perhaps over time, but it's been built up, perhaps unconsciously, but there was a process of building up. And it could be done consciously. It could be done rapidly, if they knew how to do it. And then you will notice, when you enter that shop, as you walk in, and I found this happening many times to me, and then it took me a while to recognize what was happening. I would skirt on the edges, wandering, looking inside, looking deeper, but not going in. I would skirt on the edges and then move out. And it took me a while to recognize that there was a sense that if I crossed a certain boundary and went in, the grip of that energy would be too strong. And I found that once I was conscious of it, you go deep and then you feel as if compelled to buy. I've come here, I don't need anything, I just came window shopping, but now that I'm inside this field of energy, I have to buy. And you can't somehow let go and you say, okay, let me just take something small. And if you think about what made you come to that decision, it was not a rational thought, it was a desire impulse. In the psychology as it is taught of marketing, there is an enormous importance given to what is called impulse buying. And often many things are designed to promote impulse buying. They put the brightest, most attractive objects on the front, so someone walking by feels the impulse suddenly to catch, not realizing that that impulse can actually be built up. Often it is built unconsciously, but it can be consciously built up. And the result is, well, suddenly your sales shoot up. But this is to make the distinction of conscious powers, beings, and living influences. Actually, these are influences which have a life of their own. And if the person suddenly transfers shop to another place, the influence may be left behind, unless you were to consciously transplant it also. And for no reason at all, the next person who comes will find his sales boosting up, and he doesn't realize it had to do with the energy there. Or the reverse. One of these shops which is doing so badly, the fellow shuts down the shop and sells it. Someone else comes, renovates, but if they have not changed the energy, sales are dull. They don't realize that they're just victim of the environment of that energy. And that's the reason why in the Indian traditions, they always have inaugural pujas and havans to purify, to bring good luck, to invoke whatever divine is the word we will use for everything, deities or powers to amplify your good luck, which is what vital, attractive energy of desire, money flow, whatever form it takes. But there are methods which are used to do that. But now he comes to something even more interesting. As we awaken to the higher planes of our existence, we become aware of them as friends or enemies, powers which seek to possess or which we can master, overcome, pass beyond, and leave behind. And this part has certain very important implications in traditions such as the Kabbalah, using the same principle which is in the Vedic tradition of the gods, almost like a stairway, each helping you climb to one step, but then you have to overpass them to go to the next, taking the help of the next, and so on. Which interestingly is the basis, because of the strong influence the Kabbalah has in European occult traditions, is the basis for much of European occultism. So you try to build friendships with certain powers and things like that. It is this possible relation of the human being with the powers of the life world which occupied to so large an extent European occultism, especially in the Middle Ages, as well as certain forms of Eastern magic and spiritualism. And you will see the same thing today is coming back in a very large way all over the world in traditions which are witchcraft or Wicca as they call it, or what is generally known as shamanic traditions. And it was one of the discussions I had in one of the conferences I was at in Europe a few weeks ago. But I said, because this is a group of teachers who will teach yoga, asanas, have a genuine spiritual interest or inclination. And I said to someone asked about something shamanic, some great shaman. I said, how do you know the person is spiritually developed? And they said, yeah, but it's a famous shaman and they can do things, they talk to things and they do things. But what does it have to do with spirituality? And if you recognize that the bulk of what passes as shamanism is only vital, it's engaging with vital beings, nature, spirit, and it stops there. So I said, what do they do? What do they teach? Interfacing with nature spirits, that's it, and it stops there. It's not going to the oneness which is beyond nature. Then it has no spiritual value. So I said, first, it can be extremely useful for what it does. But is that what you want? And you should be clear about it. And if it is what you want, then recognize also what else comes with it as a package deal. But it's a common error to label anybody coming from any ethnic tradition or old culture tradition. So and so comes from the Mayan shamanic tradition, or somebody from the Amazon forest tribe, any name. And somehow we want to give to them this mystical fantasy, great value. But stop and ask, what are they preaching? What do they represent in their own words? No problem. And then see, is it an effort to go to the underlying oneness of the spirit, or is it dealing with forces, powers and beings? Even if they call it spiritual, it's not spiritual, it is vital. And we should be able to recognize it. Of course, you have to be diplomatic, you deal with them in their language if required, but recognize what it represents. They have lots of teaching methods they call spiritual healing. No, it has nothing to do with spirituality, it has to do with vital energies. Take it for what it is, whatever branding they may give to it. They will call ascended masters. What are these masters? Okay, they are human beings who have ascended to great heights, and now you're relating to them. What level are they at? Are you even competent to recognize? And if you observe the characteristics of their help or their demand on you, you get the idea very quickly. Some of them will even impersonate what to you may appear to be spiritual values. They will demand from you some hard, strong practices of austerities to purify yourself so that you can be pure enough to receive their influence and do whatever it is they will heal through you. Vital, not spiritual. At best, they may be in the domain of the mental and the vital meeting, which is even more powerful. Sri Aurobindo says the asuras are the beings of the mental vital domain, and they are more powerful because they have the power of reason, but not spiritual. The very fact that they have a demand on you to be able to act in the world, they need you to be able to act in the world, it's not spiritual. And if you compare what it has to do with the teaching of spirituality as spiritual teaching, not these teachings, you will see the difference straight away. There the whole goal is to make you an instrument for their action. And they may say it is your higher self, or they will put you in touch with your higher self. No, it's all not so. In the theosophical literature, they have a lot of warnings about this. And there's one incident which I recall reading now, very long ago, where this person was going out of his body or entering some state in sleep or meditation where he would appear in what was a heavenly region, and there were, 10 or 12 beings sitting on thrones who said, you are now chosen for the great Messiah of the world or some great mission in the world for which you have to prepare. And they put him through these intense hardships of training and gave him assignments and tasks, and all along basically leading him down the garden path, as they say. And whatever it gave to him in terms of self-importance, he became an instrument or a tool for this, let's say, group of beings. And it may appear to him in the imagery of his perception heavenly, but it is one of those heavens of the vital worlds. So much of this occultism and even certain forms of magic and spiritualism and shamanism today, Wicca, etc., it's all to do with the realm of the vital, nothing greater. At best it is vital with a reflection of some higher idealism or some touch of a spiritual light which gives to it a more pure, uplifting character, but still being primarily vital. It binds you, it limits you, and it has always a consequence which I will only describe as failure. It has to fail at some point because of the nature of the vital, which divides and splits. Because of the compulsion of desire, there's always a negative which comes, and eventually the whole thing collapses. You will recall Sri Aurobindo's comment about this, not wanting publicity. And he says, publicity always brings with it a whole horde of useless people who come and spoil the work. And then he says, it creates a movement. And a movement always means a bang or a bust. And I want neither. Interesting comment. That's the nature of the vital. And the moment you see the sudden dramatic increase of a movement, a group, a cult, whatever form it may be represented as, you know that there is a vital being or inspiration or energy behind which makes it so. In another of the evening talks, Sri Aurobindo is asked, what do beings of the vital world do? He says they create great movements. That's their job, that's what they represent. They create as if a world which is representation of their consciousness through which they grip humanity or want to build a large collective, even if they are benevolent. And they may do a lot of good, but it still is only a vital good. It does not bring with it the spiritual touch. At best it may throw in a few beautiful ideas, suggestions, but the prime driver of the movement is still the vital. Then the last sentence of this paragraph, which we had read last time, the superstitions of the past, and he puts superstitions in quote marks, because they are not really superstition. As we understand it, the word superstition means something which is a false belief, which has no real basis. A cat passes in front of you, so you'll have bad luck. A superstition. Walking under a ladder, you'll have bad luck. Eating during eclipse, you will fall sick. All these are classified as superstition. And he says, much superstition there was. That is to say, much ignorant and distorted belief. So, behind each of these things, even if you call them superstition, there was something, some principle, some truth, but which you did not understand for what it is, or the belief was distorted, or he says, false explanations. Actually, things are happening that way, but you are explained in this way. And so, and obscure and clumsy dealing with the laws of the beyond. There are laws, there are principles, just as there are laws and principles of physical matter. There are laws and principles of the vital worlds, mental worlds, even to some extent spiritual, but not laws. They are more on the level of principles. And there is a continuum across. There is a blending of these in the points where they meet. And so he says, the superstitions of the past had yet behind them truths, which a future science, capital S, delivered from its sole preoccupation with the material world, may rediscover. They had been discovered in the past. They have been obscured by all these distorted beliefs, false explanations, obscure and clumsy dealings. And they may be rediscovered. But for that you have to liberate from the exclusive preoccupation with the material world. And this is being attempted. And this was the last conference that I was in at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where through scientific measures they're trying to get into all these different phenomena. And some of the experiments they've done are so fascinating just to read about them. One of the things, for example, which they spoke of is experiments where ordinary people were shown to have some powers of healing, of precognition, and various things like that. Influences on plants, and people interacting with plants, changing plant influences, and so on. And it's fascinating to see. All of these are published papers with all the most rigid tests. But in one of the most recent experiments, which they only briefly told us about, they were looking for genetic markers for people who have psychic powers. And apparently they did discover. And the genetic variants have to do with a particular part of the brain which is associated with higher opening of the mind, interestingly. And the question of course comes whether you have the higher opening because of the gene, or whether the fact that you develop the higher opening through whatever process leads to a change in the biology which now adapts itself to become a more fluid and flexible container for that higher opening. And that they have not yet done. But the problem in their approach, which is always starting from matter, trying to explain the spiritual experience from a genetic marker, that obsession with matter is what binds it. And it was a very interesting presentation by one of their senior representatives, where he was trying to explain the connection between matter and consciousness, and he presented it thus. So far we saw matter giving rise to life and emotions and mind and intelligence, and then out of that somehow self-aware consciousness. How did this come? And there's a struggle to explain it. They cannot. So his solution was, you take out consciousness from the top and put it below matter. So the whole process is really unfolding of consciousness. Brilliant. But with a massive flaw. There's a difference between consciousness involved and consciousness evolved. And the connection between these two is then lost. And so in my presentation I tried to bring in the yogic perspective of this both involution and evolution and the relationship between these layers. And I said this has implications for the whole experimenter's thinking and even the form of the experiment in two things which it brings which are not there in current thought. First, that this approach distinguishes between involved consciousness and evolved consciousness, involved life and evolved life. Distinguishing between these is critical because your experiment has to be designed accordingly. Second, I think I gave this example that if you want to do an experiment, we'll come to that. Second, it distinguishes between gradations of energy. So far in the experiment, they always think of energy, healing energy, everything is energy. But you have totally different phenomena and you're unable to make sense of it. And I said you have to distinguish the different gradations of energy. If you're going to move an object with an intervention, what they call psychic intervention, you move an object, the grade of energy is nearly physical. Whereas if you are recording a telepathic connection, then the grade of energy is much finer. So you can't just say energy and expect it all to be the same. And this thinking comes from the physical materialist viewpoint, where matter is energy and it is one energy, one matter, just showing different forms. But it's not so. The moment you accept the vital world, you have gradations of energy. Equally, gradations of consciousness. And you have to distinguish between them and design experiments around them. And so, my reason in mentioning these things is to show you that actually current science being still locked up into this materialist objective, even in its attempt to explore energy and consciousness from below up. And although almost every speaker there spoke of a top-down model where consciousness comes first, they still could not break out of the materialist bias which sees consciousness, energy and matter as just flat monotone reality. And it needs this deeper insight, the way Sri Aurobindo presents it, to give you the deeper and more complex perspective by which we can rebuild science or develop what he calls here a future science. That will then seamlessly bridge physical science, including material physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and the occult realm and the spiritual domain in one continuum. And so this was one of the things I showed because I used a PowerPoint slide. I said all of these domains which are in current human knowledge, separate fields of knowledge. You see, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, you can add a whole lot of others. I don't remember, I had a list of 15, 10, 12, 15 of them. And all of these are built on independent first principles. So psychology is built on certain starting points of observation. It's mostly empirical. It doesn't even have first principles, mostly. Physics is also empirical, but it has certain first principles on which they build it. But they're different. And on the other side of this pile of different knowledge systems, on the other side is yoga, which unites all these domains of knowledge. And interestingly, in the yoga tradition, each of these subdomains are also specialized, but each of these is derived from the same first principles. The same first principles which apply to physics, apply to chemistry, apply to biology, apply to psychology, and to occultism, and the spiritual. What an amazing achievement. And Unfortunately, it was a short and rapid presentation, but to those who got it, it was wow. Can you imagine that the same first principles of physics are now applied to develop psychology? What an achievement! And that is already done by the yoga knowledge. If we can take inspiration from this, I said you don't have to throw out what science has developed, but draw from the knowledge, and these yogis had head start of several thousand years for a science which is barely 200 years old in comparison. If you take these insights and weave them into the current science, that could be the beginning of what Sri Aurobindo is pointing to here as a future science. And then Sri Aurobindo comes to the next paragraph, and this is where now we will pick up where we left off. But why then are we not normally aware of so much that is behind us and always pressing upon us? You see, the picture he has given us is this whole world, and worlds, not just one world, so many planes within the vital, subplanes. All of these are pressing down. And in us as human beings, there is this whole connection in the subliminal vital, which opens out to the vital world. And from there, all these influences pouring in, positive, negative, all kinds of desires. Pressing down is the word he used. It's not a casual influence. I pass by, I catch a whiff of perfume. No, it's pressing down, it's pushing you, driving you to do what it wants. Actively, 24 hours. And worlds doing this to you right now. And we are unconscious, unaware. Why then are we not normally aware of so much that is behind us and always pressing upon us? And he answers, and the answer goes through several parts, but first, for the same reason that we are not aware of the inner life of our neighbor, although it exists as much as our own and is constantly exercising an occult influence upon us. So now we'll see other parts of the answer, but the first answer is, he says, same reason. He has not told you what the reason is. But the same reason. You're sitting next to somebody. I was sitting in an aircraft to come here for what, totally maybe 18, 20, 19 hours, 2 flights, but still. Sitting next to somebody, behind me somebody, and if I'm in a middle seat, then I'm surrounded by so many people, maybe up to 300 or 400 if it's a large enough airplane. All of their thoughts, all of their emotions, all of their energies, their aura is blending, shooting right through each other and through you. And if you were a little bit conscious, you might just find yourself overwhelmed and suffocated, depending of course on the group of people that's there, but mostly it is quite overwhelming and suffocating. But we are not aware. We are not aware that the person sitting next to us may be going through a severe depression or some inner conflict of emotions or thoughts or grieving some loss. We are blind because the person smiles and we only see the appearance on the face. So what's preventing you from recognizing, even though his inner life is as vivid to him as your inner life is as vivid to you? Why can't you experience with the same vividness his inner life? And constantly his thoughts and emotions are exercising their influence. You don't realize sitting next to this person who was depressed, you come away feeling depressed. And you don't realize, you think it's just my tiredness of being in a closed space for so long. No, there's something else which has got into you. It's an infection. And if you're conscious, you will see it normally takes about 3 days before all of that gets washed out from your system. And if certain things are sticky, you may feel the sticky part. It's almost now it stands isolated from the rest of the smoky mix that comes into your consciousness. That takes about 3 days to go, but the sticky part is there hanging, and you say, where did this come from? Not realizing it's what you caught as an infection 3 or 4 days ago. And sometimes it could manifest in a physical illness. You fall sick, you catch a cold, not realizing it came from there. You'll say, it's bacteria. No, it's not. It's the energy which infected you. So for the same reason, he says, that although these things are constantly exercising an occult influence upon us, we are not conscious. For a great part of our thoughts and feelings come into us from outside, from our fellow men, both from individuals and from the collective mind of humanity. So not only the fellow sitting next to you, not only the people surrounding you in the bus or in the aircraft, not only from the people in houses surrounding your house, not only from the large mass of people in the city where you are, which is already quite a suffocating influence. If you consider in Pondicherry 400,000 people, pretty compressed space, what that does in terms of thoughts and emotions, there's a huge energetic mix. And if you notice, if you're sensitive, you'll find generally after 9 p.m. it begins to die down. After 10 p.m. it becomes less. And around 11 or 12 at night, you'll find things begin to become clear. And after that it's as if there's nobody. You're in a desert. Because everybody is asleep and all the energy of their daily activities and the thoughts generated by all that has all gone calm. And you can actually feel as if you're alone in the city at the level of thoughts and energies, active thoughts and energies. Of course, there are passive states. That influence is there, almost like an environmental influence. And you're living in it. But you can create your own bubble inside it. And then, but he's taking it all the way to collective mind of humanity. That's much bigger. You cannot escape that. The very fact that you're a human being puts you into this collective human mind field. And what's interesting is this human mind field actually influences every individual who is in the human incarnation. Even as every individual is contributing to this human mind field. And one of the experiments which was spoken about here in the conference is what they call Global Consciousness Project, where they measure vibrations of specific atoms in a little device plugged into a computer, which creates random patterns. All these patterns coalesce to make for a random pattern, which then shows you the collective mind alignment. When large numbers of people think the same thing or feel the same thing, the randomness becomes less. And it shows you that the thought state of the collective actually influences physically all the atoms of the physical earth. And just that as a measurement shows you the mind world and the vital world are not really cut off from the physical. They are part of a continuum. But here what you're measuring on a physical level is the mind field. And what is fascinating, as one quick example, I've spoken of this many times before, but if you observe the way this effect is measured on, let's say, New Year's Eve, and measure the last 10 seconds just before New Year, before midnight, you'll know that maybe millions of people are partying, but the last 10 seconds, all the partying and the chaos stops. People are doing a countdown, looking at the watch. At that point, the measure peaks because people are in alignment on a single thought, a single emotion, single focus, and at the stroke of midnight, again they fall back into chaos. So your graph rises last 10 seconds and then falls again. Except, you notice the graph actually rises and falls according to time zones. So in the Indian Standard Time Zone, you have the peak. In the next time zone, you have the next peak half an hour later. Next time zone, 1 hour later, peak. 1 hour later, peak. It's a peak rippling across the earth. And if you could see this, visualize this in terms of a clairvoyant sight that sees the vital and mental consciousness of humanity, you'll see a ripple of alignment. Let's say it represents to you as a brightness, as if this part glows momentarily. And then drops, and the next half an hour later glows, drops. Next 1 hour later glows, drops. Rippling across a wave of aligned consciousness going around the earth with the midnight time zones. And not realizing that each individual in the time zone is at that moment influenced by all this. And if physical atoms are influenced, of course our minds and emotions are much more influenced. And then if you could see this on a bigger level, you will see these influences from alignments of the sun, the moon, and other planets, the astrological alignments, which suddenly create an influence on the whole of the earth and on the mind field of humanity. So let's say Mercury now goes into retrogression. What Mercury represents as an influence is your discriminating intellect. And the moment it goes into retrogression, it's as if all the powers of the discriminating intellect begin to dull down. What does it mean? Well, people are going to behave more irrationally, or impulsive behaviors will tend to rise. And all of us, as part of the human mind, are under influence of this. Of course, individually you can break out because you're more conscious, you're able to act, modify, but the collective influence is there to the extent that you're unaware and living by instinct and impulse. It determines your behavior. There's a very clear documentation, this was one of the graphs which we saw in this discussion in the conference, that whenever there are solar flares, human crime and accidents go up. It is fascinating to see the cycles of solar flares going back 100 years. So the graph goes up and down, and then sometimes less solar flares. Sometimes the rising is slow, sometimes it's fast. And mapped with wars, I think, that they mapped it to wars and conflicts. Exactly the same pattern. When the solar flare rises in a slope, the wars rise in a slope. When it rises rapidly, the wars rise rapidly. When it hits a high peak, the human conflicts hit a high peak. And it was an exact match. And these are all published results. The data is available, anybody can verify. And what this shows you is, this collective human mind itself is under influence of larger cosmic energies. But we are under influence of the collective mind and not just the individual minds around us. So, a great part of our thoughts and feelings come into us from outside, from our fellow men, both from individuals and from the collective mind of humanity. So, his first answer, why are we not aware of all this? For the same reason that we are not aware of what's happening in people sitting next to us, although they are aware of it with the same vividness that we are aware of ourselves. Second part of the answer, he says, and for the same reason that we are not aware of the greater part of our own being, which is subconscient or subliminal to our waking mind, and is always influencing and in an occult manner determining our surface existence. So his second answer is the same reason why we are not aware of our own deeper inner parts. Now, you see, the way Sri Aurobindo puts it, in layered answer, there are things there are implications here. And one of the implications is, I am not conscious of what's happening in my neighbor because I am not conscious of what is happening within me in my subliminal parts. And the two things are connected. It's the same reason. And what's that reason? And then he says, next sentence, it is because we use normally only our corporeal senses and live almost wholly in the body and the physical vitality and the physical mind. And it is not directly through these that the life world enters into relations with us. So here we are. This is the key. How does that influence come in? That is done through the other sheaths of our being. Other bodies, as they are called in a later terminology from Upanishads. The mental sheath or subtle body in which our true mental being lives, and the life sheath or vital body which is more closely connected with the physical or food sheath and forms with it the gross body of our complex existence. So the idea is this: we are not conscious of what's happening in the others. We are not conscious of what's happening inside us, although that's having a huge influence on us, even determining our whole behavior, because we are bound in our physical senses and almost wholly we live in the body and in the physical vitality and the physical mind. That is the part of the vital developed in the physical body and the part of the mind developed in the physical body and with physical senses, and that's it. Whereas all those things are taking place in the other layers in which we don't live and whose senses we do not use. So again, enormous implications. I'll touch upon a few. We will review this text next Friday and go deeper into it. But first suggestion is, if we could begin to live in those sheets, if we could begin to use the senses which belong to those sheets, then we would be able to experience all this as vividly as we experience the physical world through our physical senses. But the other implication is this: because we are so stuck in the physical world and the physical senses, we are actually blind to all the rest of reality. And although we have a vivid physical life experience, that life experience itself is as if curtailed. It's largely damaged, reduced to only the physicality of it. So I look at the flower, I only see its physical form. I do not feel its life force, its mind imprint, its psychic presence. I meet the person and I see only his smiling or sad face. I do not feel the life they live, the thoughts and emotions they have. And if I could become aware of that within me on my subliminal levels, I would be able to be aware of them in their deeper layers also. And so you see how these three things are connected. We cannot be aware of what's happening in them because we are not aware of what's happening in us, because we are stuck in the physical sheath only. Physical senses and physical life and mind, that's all that is existing for us. In fact, what the yoga does, and this is the whole point of this discussion and this chapter, is to make us bit by bit conscious in those deeper layers of our own subtle body, and through the subtle body conscious of the life plane and the mind plane. And as a result of this widening of our consciousness, deepening of our consciousness, we automatically become aware of what's happening in other people, because that's where the entry points are of that experience. But we become aware of things inside us which had so far a huge influence. They determined our surface life and even our behavior and our health, of course. But we were unaware of the things which were determining it. We become more free, more close to a personal mastery, although still in an ignorant physical, vital, mental life. Not yet spiritual. But having acquired this, not only we are in a position of a greater, richer life experience, but greater possibility of self-mastery, but then also in the ability, greater possibility of opening to the higher spiritual influences. And this will be part of a larger discussion, because entry into those higher regions requires us to be able to become conscious of these intermediate gradations. And if things of those higher gradations are to influence our surface life, they have to pass through these intermediate gradations. And if we have not unified them, if we have not organized them around the central aspiration, that influence does not have a receptive and stable vehicle or instrument to come and manifest and lead our life or express itself in our life. So all of this knowledge of the inner parts of your own consciousness, and with it the knowledge of the inner of the rest of others and of humanity and of the universe, all of this will become a necessary passage. Although we need not spend time and energy to broaden it out to be able to see and sense things around us, but it is enough if we are able to become conscious in each of these levels, even in a small part of us, and as if forming a line, a passage of continuity of awareness which links all the way to the higher spiritual consciousness. And so a passage built, a continuum formed, that consciousness can now begin to fill, purify, work in us, broaden, liberate, and so on, until eventually it develops within you the universality which it needs to fully manifest its possibilities, and all the rest which comes as a side effect of that universalization will be there. But our immediate, most urgent responsibility is to become conscious and create that continuity, form it within us. So Sri Aurobindo will be speaking of this and the role of the physical organs and the plexus of our physical life and mentality. So the centers of chakras, and what will be necessary to become conscious with the life world and other worlds, and even develop into more subtle experiences by which we can better understand and work on our material life, and eventually even become fully conscious on all these planes, as much as we are conscious on this physical plane. And then in the next paragraph, he will move to a briefer description of the mental world and its relation with these lower two. And then he moves from there to the realms of the spiritual, and in particular the supramental, which is the fully liberated spiritual domain and its relation with these. So that's the structure of the rest of the chapter, where he increasingly becomes more and more compact. Because the bulk of what he had to present, you will see, he spent the maximum time in the physical, and then relatively less in the vital, although it's quite detailed, and then the mental even less, and then the supramental about as much as the mind. So we'll pause here. It has been a kind of a recapitulation of the whole chapter, starting with the first important idea of why we need to become conscious of these planes for the purpose of the integral yoga, why it was not important in other systems, through to this point. And we can take up any comments or questions.
Shamaru, recently I looked on the again to this room, and he have a conference with him, and he tell very, very interesting work with Aurobindo. For example, I don't tell story with the people when I'm living, but recently one woman take drugs. I don't use any external power. I offer to Sri Aurobindo another 2 years non-stop. And recently I received order, mother tell me, do something now. And it's very important that on detail you offer everything to Sri Aurobindo. But listen, Charlie. I receive, you don't never imagine affluence and some houses under near my home, living near me. And recently I meet her, she came to me and tell me, I stop now. You help me in the health and you help my daughter. Alors just I tell you, not only one thing, but it's very, 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 very important. I don't, secrétaire tell me, denounce her to working committee or will consider, etc., etc. I never denunciation anybody. Just I tell you my experience this year, and not only one, but many. But it's very, very, very important. I help, I call to her and daughter, showing that the mother is not really connected with her.
Yes.
People forget to offer to Sri Aurobindo everything, every day, night. Sorry, but it's very important for me.
Yes. Yes.
Today in the paper, I saw that they're beginning a cinema film festival at the Alliance Française, an annual film festival. And the other day on the internet, I had looked up to see what is going on in different cities like Dubai, Los Angeles, Paris, London, to see what kind of films they were showing. So a lot of it was about murder and all kinds of horrible stuff. So tonight I want to express an aspiration that from here we might, from Oregon especially, and Ashram, we might aspire for mother and children to really enter the field of cinema and upgrade. Because I know we have one psychotherapist here, so I'm thinking that in the realm of psychology, what you have said about living influences, not penetrating people, that through cinema, if they were started to make more psychological films, they've been showing some really good films lately in ashram. But to help people have an insight into themselves, because most people just love cinema. And they love to go, so I thought this is an area which I hope soon will really be upgraded. Because how many thousands of people in all these cities are seeing this stuff?
Just to put this comment in context, cinema is one of the most powerful influences because it has almost a hypnotic character. Because of the flickering screen, it puts you in a state of clinical hypnosis and then shows you these experiences which you automatically identify with and therefore absorb. And so Mother was very particular that in the ashram the children should not be exposed to cinema theaters, restaurants, and of course the cinema itself. Because these spaces are so coarse and so low in vibration. So it's not enough that you don't go to the cinema theater or the restaurant, that's one whole different story. But the cinema itself then, she ensured that what was shown to the children was edited, carefully selected and so on, precisely because of this deep influence. But now if you think of the humanity and the collective mind field of humanity, what this is doing. Take a local space as an example. If in a city there is a football match or a cricket match or one of those typical exciting games where people come and scream and shout and get all worked up, it's interesting to see how it creates such a strong vital excitement that even people who are in the city not present in the domain of the physical location are influenced by it. I had this very interesting occasion. Once I was in Delhi, I was staying with some friends who lived about, let's say, half a kilometer away from a stadium where there was a cricket match going on. One of those big ones where everybody's excited. And so you could hear the shouting of the crowd half a kilometer away and the lights bright there. You could feel the vital energy surging around it. And at the same time, my host had the TV on, which had the same broadcast. What was interesting was you could literally identify the quality of energy coming through the TV and the energy which was there directly at a distance, except that the TV had a lag of about 3 seconds. Now that was my experience, a lag of about 3 seconds, so probably that's the time it takes for them to send it to the satellite and back. But here it would hit, the wave would hit, and then the wave would come from the TV. Smaller, milder, but still it was there, the excitement, energy. But imagine what it does to an entire city or an entire country when World Cup football and your country is now in the finals. Imagine what it does to the country and the waves of excitement it creates. And now extend this to what the news shows you. When the news puts a blast of negative images or negative messages on a day, it can tilt the mood of the whole country energetically. And even though you have not seen the news, you wake up next morning from your sleep and you're feeling this strange thing, and then you find going into your workspace, people are telling you the bad news. But your subliminal had already caught that energy burst that was dumped on you. And then cinema, particularly, which is increasingly becoming more and more dark and violent, or television, which is pumping these types of images and energies. So in my personal experience, for a time when I had cable television, I noticed that it had this addictive character. It would pull. And at a particular time I would feel the pull. I look at the watch, it's 9 o'clock. And then I said, okay, what happens if I switch off the TV physically? People press the remote, the TV goes into this sleep state. But with the remote you can switch on. So energetically it is still sleeping but alive, it's radiating. So I switch it off physically, the pull was less. When I disconnected the cable physically, that's when the pull stopped. So what is interesting is the physical cable becomes almost like a carrier of an energy which comes, and the quality of programming which is being pumped through is coming into your house through the cable and infecting you, your personal space, without you realizing it. Just the fact that the cable is plugged in is already radiating a certain energy. And we are not normally conscious of these things, but think of what it has done to humanity. And it's just 20 years since cable has become present all over India on such a scale. And you can see how it has changed the collective consciousness. And then the fact that people actively watch and drink in, and its influence on the mind field. And it makes you wonder. And if you could visualize the opposite, what if in an entire community we chose to watch only positive, inspiring, uplifting cinema? We chose to have only positive, uplifting news. And even if negative things are there, we present it in a way that gives to you a positive, forward-looking hope. Contextualize it in a positive way. What it would do to the collective field of humanity, and perhaps the quality of this field and its openness to higher possibilities may precipitate the higher possibilities sooner. Think about this. If your entire humanity mind field is about, it's going to get worse, this is how it is, and conceiving of the future in a negative way, the new world that's trying to bring in a new light and a new possibility does not have entry points. The field is repelling it. If instead the field turns and becomes open consciously to the higher possibilities and invokes them, it can plunge rapidly and join with the receptive state. So even if we can't do this for humanity, can we begin to do this within our community? Can we make this field in Aurobindo, this ideal and this hope and this possibility, can we collectively aspire for it and create programs which assist and promote and strengthen the field? And if not within that, in a smaller part of the community, or at the very least within our personal lives in our house. And the first step to that, of course, will be to become conscious. Be conscious of these influences that come. You don't need to fear them. You don't need to be always trying to purify and block and fight. None of that is needed. Rather you strengthen your positive aspiration and the realm of your space which is filled with this aspiration. And those things come, they don't get a hook, they bounce off. You don't need to fight anything. And then if it can grow to make a collective space, it would make a huge difference. Yes. Yes.
Recently, I want to stop my TV. I don't. It's very
Yes. Yes.
I have news and sometimes little feed.
Right.
And recently, I don't use so much.
Yes.
Next time I stop.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for your ideas.
So in the same context, I would like to share. I
Mhm.
And so the thought as in you start having a positive affirmation
Mhm.
and those suggestions. What I have observed, like then people or individuals, they take it as a mental way.
Mhm.
It becomes more mechanical.
Okay.
Saying that offering to the mother, it becomes more mechanical.
Yes.
And so after a few days only, the person will not find a step forward.
Yes.
Even personally, when I have implemented this kind of techniques,
Mhm.
and then I realized that without having listen from above and force will not penetrate within us, the things will not move forward.
Mhm. Yes. Yes, absolutely true. In fact, any kind of mechanical repetition is helpful because at best it creates a positive field, but is not enough. And often it loses force precisely because it's not enough. Something is missing. And when you feel that happening, you have to review and see what you need to correct. Unfortunately, some of these phrases or key ideas are often exaggerated because it's convenient or because people don't really understand what they truly represent. And so just offer it to the mother is one of those formulas which is often misused and misunderstood by trying to reduce everything to you offer it and then mother will take care of it. How? Why don't you start offering your need for food? Mother, I am hungry, I offer it to you. And I sit back. Will it work? You will die. Because your body needs food. And mother is not going to materialize a hand which will cook the food and then put it in your mouth. Right? She has given you an intelligence and she has given you a hand for you to cook and eat. So where exactly do you stop with offering and stop? Or is offering a first step towards an action? And if you just take this example, you're hungry, well, what do? You prepare the food. You offer the food. You invoke her force in the food to eat, to nourish your body. But throughout you're doing an active process of an action in life which is going to change your life circumstances with that state of receptivity and offering of the problem in order to find a solution to be able to act on it. And unfortunately, all of this is thrown out with this very simple formula of a passive offering and passive surrender, which Aurobindo says is actually harmful. I've actually seen, and it's not nice to say this in a public space, but one of the centers which teaches Sri Aurobindo's teaching, publishes Sri Aurobindo's writings, etc., brought out a little booklet which is based on the lectures of the head of the center, where the conclusion of what that man presents, and he's teaching this in the name of Sri Aurobindo's teaching, he says, and so the solution to all the problems of life is to become a passive instrument by making a passive surrender to the mother in everything you do. Wow. You'll find a direct statement of Sri Aurobindo which says passive surrender is not going to do anything. In fact, if anything, it harms. But this is what the person takes, because in his mind he has picked up a piece, warped it to fit his limited understanding, mixed with his fancy and projecting it as the teaching. So you find a lot of mixed ideas which come up. The moment you find simple formulas, this is how it is, do it. If it works, great, as long as it works. The moment it stops working, stop and review. Maybe this is too simplistic a formula, or it catches a side of a truth which is broader, and now I need to widen to the larger truth. And in this particular case, yes, positive view, positive affirmation are all useful, but then it has to be translated into an action. The positive perspective must be the leader of your plan and action for the future. Again, it cannot be in isolation. A positive perspective doesn't mean you ignore the negative. You must be able to see the negative from the positive perspective and see how it is to be used or taken advantage of or modified or defeated for the positive outcome. But you cannot cut off reality and say, I will ignore this and stay positive, then everything positive will happen. No. You'll get a knock from the negative which will shake you up to say, I am also there, you need to take me into account. So that's how life will help us to broaden if we lock ourselves into an erroneous position. But I'm glad you brought this up because it needs to be seen more deeply. There's an example which is often quoted by people. It's a message given by the mother to Champaklalji. And people quote this and say, well, this is all you have to do. Why? Because mother says this is all you have to do. Mother writes to him, she says, be simple, be happy, be quiet, do your work as well as you can, and remember me. I think she adds, remember me at all times. That is all that is asked of you. So, people take this, put it up on their desk, be simple, be happy, be quiet, do your work as well as you can. I'm doing the yoga. Except the context of that was, Champaklal said to the mother, Mother, I'm with you almost 24 hours a day. Didn't even have enough time to eat or to sleep. He was with her because she was on a pace of literally 24 hours a day. She would sleep an hour or two at most, if at all, and he had to keep up with her. He says, Mother, I don't even have time for my food. How can I sit to meditate, concentrate, read, or do anything which are necessary for my growth? And so to him, Mother says, this is all that is asked of you. Because he's sitting right next to her and her force is working on her with an intensity which is even for him difficult to bear, which makes him a little hard and even crude and a little reactive in a certain way. And Mother said about this, people who are too close to her physically, they can't bear the intensity, they tend to form a shell just to manage the intensity, and so they end up being a little more crude than others. But that's more a protective poise. But in that situation, this was her guidance to him. Now you can't take it out of that context and then apply it as a guidance. Then why have all these discussions? You see? Unfortunately, why these simplistic phrasings have a great power of attraction for people is because they take the burden of responsibility away from you. It will be done. I've surrendered, now it's her responsibility. I don't have to do anything. I can go on being myself. So you kind of get free of any responsibility for your actions, but because also they strongly align to the ascetic way. And unfortunately, the power of the ascetic teaching is still very strong in the mind of humanity. The moment you bring a spiritual ideal or a spiritual seeking, straight away there's this rush of all the ascetic examples, ideals, energies, values, everything rushes in. In one of the journals published by someone who is a devotee and quoting from the mother and Sri Aurobindo, in one of the journals, this person put up a story of coming, I think, from the Buddhist tradition. Perhaps it was about this elephant, magical elephant, who has a golden tusk, cuts off a piece to give it to a woodcutter who is poor, and then the cutter comes back and says, I want more, until he builds a palatial house, until the elephant dies bleeding because all his tusk has been cut off by the woodcutter from his generosity and the other fellow's greed. And when finally he dies bleeding, from heaven all the flowers fall on him and all the gods say, what a great person you are. And I'm seeing this published in a journal connected with the ashram, and I say, what? This has nothing to do with the ideal which we have of spirituality. It is that passive, ascetic, suffering which leads to great reward in heaven idea, which is a complete perversion of spirituality. And it comes in, it creeps in, and people don't even see it because they're so clouded or mixed by the ascetic values and examples. Look for any great spiritual example in history. Bulk of them will be ascetic. Unfortunately, we don't have enough of the affirmative spirituality examples out there. And so one has to be very careful. You must be able to carefully discriminate and extract the spiritual content of that example. Even in so great an example as Ramakrishna Paramahansa, he had this aversion to money. And Swami Vivekananda, I believe, or one of his disciples, tested him by putting coins under his mattress. And as he lay down, he felt his body burning and got up. So here's an excellent example of the ascetic rejection of money. And yet from such a great being that you have to call him an avatar. But the particular incarnation, the particular message which he had to convey in that incarnation was such. And you have to keep that context in mind. So it's not easy to free yourself from the taint of the ascetic values of spirituality. And that's why when you read Sri Aurobindo, one has to be careful not to read with that blinker. And if you read in the whole and not compilations, then Sri Aurobindo ensures that he erases the ascetic taint and awakens in you that affirmative consciousness that sees the divine, affirms the divine, seeks to realize in life and in matter. But then you have to go from the beginning. That's when he first prepares you with that and then only gets you into these deeper dimensions. If you skip that and read only a selection or one of these compilations, they do great injustice because they can be read with an ascetic view or affirmative view and you don't know which one it is because it's a snippet cut out. Yes. So, wait.
This is a process of evolution.
Yes.
Also your form, your
Exactly.
is a process.
Yes. And to be able to accept all this and turn it into a means for our growth. Cinema has to be turned into a means for a growth and awakening and upliftment.
For example, when I open TV, I offer to show you
Yes.
after I go bathroom.
Yes.
Take shower.
You see, one of the things Mother had One of the things Mother had in mind for Auroville was creating a studio for cinema. She had got people ready to invest, she had identified the land, she had worked out the financing for it, everything. It didn't take off, unfortunately, because the person who promised did not follow through with his promise. And in those days it was very expensive. Now, of course, it's much more easy and these things will happen. But we have not given enough importance to the utility of media for the spiritual evolution and awakening. All these tools, even the mobile phone, has to be used and turned in a positive direction.
Now the pressure is
Mhm.
clean everything.
Yes.
You are finished.
Yes. The demand of the new consciousness against the resistance of the old builds a pressure wherever there is resistance. And it takes two forms. Either the pressure compels the change, or the pressure breaks the part that is resisting. And in practice it does both. There's a part which is cracking up, breaking up, and there's a part which is breaking out, awakening. And the two are happening simultaneously. And again, to distinguish which is difficult. And Sri Aurobindo writes about this, going back almost nearly 100 years now. He says, it takes discrimination to recognize what belongs to the old world which has to be rejected and what is part of the new world which has to be carried and not thrown away. So it's for each one of us to be vigilant.
It's very interesting in the beginning when you tell about some shop.
Yes,
When I go for deal, one time now it's not possible to
yes,
offer.
yes.
We have some forces, entity, and I go back.
Mhm.
I don't want
Yes.
anything.
Yes.
Suddenly it's very, very interesting.
Yes.
Slowly.
Almost everywhere in all cities, the congestion and the exaggerated amplification of desire-based life has created a field which is quite intense and compelling. And if we do not help the younger children to be aligned to a deeper sensitivity or discrimination, they are very easily sucked into and warped by these influences. But then my question is, What are we doing to reverse that influence? If the other side is building a stronger desire-based culture value, what are we doing to build a stronger spiritual-based culture and value? And if nothing else, at least here, in Aurobindo, in the ashram, in the communities or in our little homes, wherever we are, we have to push back. And this is part of the affirmative aspect of spirituality, that you have to push back with the divine values in whatever way, whatever extent you can. If you sit passive, the other side will invade because it is active. So, offering to the mother is your first step, which then prepares you to receive insight, knowledge, strength, guidance, energy, drive of action, which has to be translated into consecrated work and action, effective and forceful. Sri Aurobindo makes this observation. It is to Sahana, one of the ladies who writes to Sri Aurobindo saying, somebody X is criticizing you and it makes me feel very bad. Should I keep quiet and bear, or should I speak out? And Sri Aurobindo writes in response, if the goal of our yoga was to withdraw from the world, then the right thing would be to stay silent and remain in equality. But since the goal of our yoga is to manifest a divine truth against which enormous powers are arranged and organized, you have to act, you have to push, but from a base of equality. The base of equality should not never be lost. And then he says, if the attack was physical, then the answer would be obvious. You have to defend if someone attacks you physically. But he says, just because the attack is psychological does not mean it is any less powerful. And this is what we have to understand. There is in fact a huge battle taking place on a psychological level by the values which are anti-evolutionary. And they are much stronger and better organized. On the other side, the evolutionary forces are not so well organized. They don't have the drive. They are much more on the passivity because of the backlog of the ascetic spirituality. They are always on the back foot. They are too sensitive. The first thing that happens when you grow in consciousness, you become more sensitive. So you can't engage with something which is too intense. And the other side knows. They make it so nasty, you back off. So you'll have to develop strength in the sensitivity and power of effective knowledge, force, action, skill, etc. So all the four aspects of the Divine Mother which have to be manifested. But our state of conscious self-giving, consecration and surrender is the receptive base on which all this has to be built or can be built. So we don't stop with that. We start with that, we complete with that, but that's the container in which everything else has to grow. We'll continue this next Friday.